Grace to you and peace from God's beloved. Amen. At first glance, it looks like today's reading is a needed respite from the angry prophets that we've been listening to all summer. It begins with a love song to the beloved, before it takes a nasty turn. And Isaiah sounds like all the other prophets. It's not that their anger wasn't justified, but week after week of condemnation might make us tired of listening to tirades of sin and warnings of judgment. Hearing the prophets go on and on and on about people who have failed to live up to the standards that have been imposed on them stops us from hearing their message altogether. It's like your friend who has one single issue that they care about and won't shut up about it. They come off as joyless, hectoring, and needlessly harsh. The prophets sound extreme if all you hear are the angry bits, the drama, and the conflict. It's as if that's all they have to say. Like watching the news and all you hear is all the bad stuff that people are doing, and you think that there must be some good news somewhere. But if you read the prophet's whole work, you'll hear a more nuanced message. You'll hear less sanctimony and more hope, less outrage and more forgiveness, less ire and more mercy. In fact, you'll hear less diatribe and more poetry. As most of you know, in the Bible, a prophet isn't just someone who can predict the future, although that could be a big part of the prophet's job. A prophet is someone who speaks for God. A prophet is someone with a special authority to speak God's renewing word to a specific people in a specific time and specific place. A prophet reads the present times in order to see the future that is coming. A prophet is a poet, spinning visions of a new world. A prophet sings songs of changed lives, of people turning from a life of woundedness to a life of healing. A prophet tells stories of sin condemned and forgiveness received. A prophet exposes injustice and speaks out on behalf of the oppressed. A prophet sees a world of possibility, God's possibility, where others merely see suffering and pain. A prophet is someone who speaks more poetically than didactically. That's because the prophet's message can't always be clearly put into words. A prophet paints word pictures, igniting the imagination to see new connections and creative tensions where new visions of the world emerge. Today, Isaiah weaves a tale that leaves us with questions about how we relate to God. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. This whole passage oozes symbolism, and the symbolism morphs as the passage progresses. God is the beloved. It's an intimate image, building on Hosea's redefinition of Israel's relationship to God. Moving from a legal contractual obligation, Isaiah writes straight-up love poetry to God. The beloved in the vineyard is a sensual image. There's more than nourishment happening here. The beloved is doing more than building a vineyard. The beloved is planting seeds in fertile soil and placing protective hedges around the one the beloved loves, closing her in with intimacy. But this relationship turns rocky. The grapes are wild, like the harlot Gomer in Hosea, who was the woman who could not be trusted. The wildness of the grapes are not what the beloved was looking for. The wild grapes lack depth, refinement, and order. They are bitter rather than sweet. They are rotten on the vine. They do not delight the beloved. But instead of anger, the beloved feels sadness, grief, and even betrayal. The wildness of the grapes, its bitterness and lack of refinement, mean that the wine isn't the liquid poetry that makes the beloved come alive. So the beloved, in sadness and grief, stops what he's doing. He allows the vineyard to overgrow, giving into the wildness that has overtaken the vineyard. He removes the protective hedges, leaving the wild grapes vulnerable to the beasts, the less discerning palates, who are looking only for food to satisfy their hunger, and not for beauty or delight. The vineyard will not be tended to, and so it will grow out of control, blending into the bordering forest. So it will be indistinguishable from its surroundings. Nothing special will be seen among them. They will disappear into the neighboring wild. Then the song is explained. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. Again, we are in familiar territory. Israel breaks the relationship. God punishes Israel for what they have done. The people of God are abandoned by the one who said would never abandon them. But this time is different. The beginning of this passage begins with this preface. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. This is still meant to be a love song, but maybe a sad love song. One of those songs you listen to with a bucket of Haagen-Dazs on your lap after your boyfriend breaks up with you, or is playing at the pub when you're drinking beers with the boys after your woman left you. This whole passage is a love song for the beloved. And God doesn't come off as much of a romantic in this passage, even though God is deeply in love with Israel. What has changed is the nature of the relationship. This is a divorce, the breaking not just of a legal agreement, but of a life together. Deep sadness permeates this passage, not righteous anger. The wildness of the grapes, the bitterness of betrayal, was God's people behaving in viciously violent ways. They ignored justice for the weak and the vulnerable and showed no mercy to their enemies. They were behaving the exact opposite of how God wanted them to. And that's why God's heart was so deeply broken. God didn't recognize them anymore. It was like they ripped God's heart out of their own body. Israel had shown their beloved that they hadn't learned anything and were acting just like every other nation on earth. They couldn't claim to be the light to the nations like they could before. They couldn't say that they were holy and set apart to be God's messengers of light and life in a world caught in shadow and death. But this is still a love song they are singing. Isaiah is singing this song, not on behalf of God, but on behalf of God's people. Isaiah is singing the song of beloved to God, mirroring back to God what God was experiencing. And also, Isaiah was telling God's side of the story to God's people. This is a love song between two beloveds who have been deeply hurt, and it will take time to heal this wound. But the wound does heal. But first, the Assyrian judgment. Isaiah is explaining to the people what's happening, why Assyria is attacking them. Restoration begins after first experiencing destruction. Yes, judgment for sin is real in the Old Testament. At least that's how people interpret what was happening to them. I wish the Bible was as clean as we would like it to be, that forgiveness flows as easily as good wine. But in the Bible, Israel's restoration, the return of the beloved, doesn't happen quickly and is not without consequences. This is how Israel interpreted the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem. They saw it as God's judgment for their unfaithfulness. And that certainly was part of Isaiah's message. The parable of the vineyard makes that clear. But any talk of God's judgment is dangerous, especially if we human beings invoke judgment as punishment for sin in today's world. We can too quickly blame the victim, especially victims we don't like. Too many Christian voices out there connect terrible events as evidence of God's judgment. The mass shootings in the U.S. a few weeks ago was proclaimed as a sign of God's anger over whatever sin these churches believed was the worst. Name your sin. Gay marriage and abortion are usually identified as chief sins that gets God mad. Certainly a sin that someone else was committing. God punishes other people's sins, right? Not our own. Curious how economic disparity is never a cause of judgment, although every prophet had something to say about the wealth gap. One well-known preacher recently on Twitter said that God's judgment is a sign of God's love. The greater the punishment, the deeper the love. I don't know about you, but I've heard many spousal abusers say the same thing to excuse their violence. Judgment and punishment are expressions of brutal power. They are not signs of the beloved. On the other side, I hear people lament over their own broken lives as evidence of God's judgment. God must be punishing them for their job loss or their cancer or the death of a loved one. And people who say this usually and unfortunately are enduring tremendous sense of low self-esteem, usually brought on by mistreatment, and they believe they deserve the terrible life that they are living. They must have done something wrong to deserve what they are facing. And when I hear that, it breaks my heart. God doesn't work that way. God's heart is filled with love and mercy. A study was released recently on why young people are leaving the church, and it has nothing to do with worship style, music, or liberal or conservative theology. But it has to do with too many images of a judgmental, angry, wrathful God. There's enough judgment in this world. They don't need to come to church to hear more of it. But I don't think we dwell on God's judgment here at First Lutheran. I don't think we spend too much time condemning people's sins. But I hear what they're saying. Too many preachers think preaching against sin gives them depth, and preaching too much grace makes them wishy-washy. I think the opposite is true. Condemning sin is easy. Expressing grace is hard. Judgment is simple. Forgiveness is tough. Love is difficult. Receiving forgiveness is easier than offering forgiveness. Offering forgiveness means setting aside one's ego, recognizing that the relationship is more important than the reason why the relationship was broken in the first place. Initiating forgiveness leaves you vulnerable to rejection, and that's why it takes courage. Vulnerability isn't weakness. Vulnerability is a sign of strength. And that's why God always takes the initiative in restoring our relationship when it becomes broken. God's courage and vulnerability is revealed when God brings us back to restore our fractured relationship, knowing that there might be more rejection waiting. In the Bible and in life, it is always us who break the relationship, and it is always God who initiates forgiveness. As Christians, we confess Jesus as the one who brought the final reconciliation. But forgiveness permeates the whole Bible. When we break a relationship with God, when we are unfaithful, God reaches out to us in love. God takes our hand, leads us back to the vineyard, and the relationship is stronger than ever before. Today's reading is rendered as a love song between two beloveds. That is the defining characteristic of the relationship. God and Israel eventually reconcile as beloved. The saga of Israel and Assyria ends with Assyria's defeat, and God promises to restore order to Jerusalem and to all of Israel. A shoot shall come out from the stalk of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. David's throne will be reestablished. Peace and prosperity will reign over the kingdom. The nations of the earth will descend upon Jerusalem. You might recognize that passage from the baptismal liturgy, and you might remember hearing it during Advent. Christians read this passage as a prophecy of Jesus, and it's true. But the shoot that shall come out of the stalk of Jesse, when Jesse is David's father, isn't only Jesus, but those who bear his name. Indeed, anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord, anyone who receives this Spirit, anyone who is reconciled to God through God's love, that's anyone who sings the song of the beloved. That's you. That's everyone gathered here. And today, as you say the words of institution together for Holy Communion, remember that you are the shoot that came out from the stump of Jesse as the body of Christ, who reconciled you to God, who joins you together as one people, who has the power of restoration, living with you together. And as you receive Holy Communion today, dwell on the wine, linger with it, taste it. May its flavor remind you that you are beloved, you have been reconciled and restored to God, that in you God lives, as you drink from God's vineyard and you receive God's lifeblood in Jesus, a life that guides you in this life and leads you into eternity. And may this be so among us. Amen.